The World of All the Colors of the Dark by Suzanne Collins is one where the line between reality and nightmare blurs, where shadows move with sinister intent, and where the unseen forces lurking just beyond the edge of vision are far more than mere imagination. At the heart of this chilling tale is a young girl named Patch, a character whose life has always been touched by the inexplicable, the unsettling, and the outright terrifying. From her earliest memories, Patch has known that she is different, not in the way that most children feel unique, but in a way that suggests something deeper, something darker, something that connects her to forces beyond human understanding. Her world is one where the flicker of movement in a darkened hallway isn't just a trick of the light, where the whisper of a voice in an empty room isn't just the wind, and where the dreams that plague her sleep aren't just dreams. They're warnings. Patch's life has been marked by a series of eerie occurrences, small at first, but growing increasingly impossible to ignore. As a child, she would wake in the dead of night, convinced that someone, or something, had been standing beside her bed, watching her with unseen eyes. Her parents dismissed these episodes as night terrors, the overactive imagination of a sensitive child. But Patch knew better. She could feel the presence, a cold, creeping sensation that slithered up her spine and settled in the back of her mind like a stain. And then there were the dreams, vivid, relentless, and always the same. In them she wandered through a landscape of shifting shadows, a place where the ground was soft as rotting flesh, and the air hummed with a sound like distant screaming. And at the center of it all was him, the figure with pale, glowing eyes, a being of smoke and hunger, who called to her in a voice that was less sound and more the scrape of bones against stone. For years, Patch tried to convince herself that these were just dreams, that the things she saw and heard were nothing more than the misfirings of a tired brain. But as she grew older, the line between waking and sleeping began to blur. She would catch glimpses of movement in mirrors when no one was there, hear her name whispered in empty rooms, feel the brush of unseen fingers against her skin when she was alone. The world around her seemed to grow thinner, as though reality itself were a fragile veil, and behind it something monstrous was pressing through, reaching for her. And then, one night, the veil tore completely. It began like any other night, Patch lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, fighting the heavy pull of sleep. She had learned to dread the moment her eyes closed, knowing what awaited her in the dark. But exhaustion always won, and this night was no different. She slipped into unconsciousness, and the dream came as it always did. She was back in that shadowed place, the air thick and choking, the ground uneven beneath her feet. And there, standing before her, was the figure with the glowing eyes. This time, though, something was different. This time he spoke. "You've kept me waiting long enough," he said, his voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "It's time." Before Patch could react, the dream shattered, but she didn't wake in her bed. Instead, she found herself standing in the middle of her room, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The air was ice cold, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And then she saw it, a shadow in the corner of the room, darker than the rest, a patch of blackness that seemed to pulse like a living thing. As she watched, frozen in terror, the shadow moved, peeling itself away from the wall, taking shape. A man, or something that had once been a man, stood before her. His features were indistinct, as though he were made of smoke, but his eyes burned with a sickly yellow light. "Hello, Patch," he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth was wrong, twisted. "I've been looking for you." Patch wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this new nightmare, but her body refused to obey. The figure, the rider, as he called himself, stepped closer, and with each movement the room seemed to grow darker, the air thicker. He reached out a hand, fingers long and skeletal, and Patch knew with a certainty that chilled her blood. If he touched her, something terrible would happen, something irreversible. At the last possible second, a sound from the hallway broke the spell, her father's voice calling her name. The rider's head snapped toward the door, his expression twisting into something like fury. And then, in the space between heartbeats, he was gone, vanishing as though he had never been there at all. But Patch knew better. She could still feel the weight of his presence, the echo of his voice in her ears. And worst of all, she knew his parting words were true. This isn't over. The days that followed were a haze of fear and sleepless nights. Patch tried to tell herself that it had been a hallucination, a waking dream, anything but what she knew it truly was, a confrontation with something ancient, something hungry, something that had marked her as its own. But the signs were everywhere. Strange symbols began appearing on the walls of her room, etched into the paint as though by claws. The temperature would drop without warning, her breath fogging in the air even in the height of summer. And every night, without fail, the dreams returned, each one more vivid, more horrifying than the last. Then came the whispers. At first they were faint, barely audible, a hiss of static beneath the sound of the wind, a murmur just below the threshold of hearing. But soon they grew louder, more insistent. They spoke in a language Patch didn't recognize, but the meaning was clear all the same. He is coming, and when he finds you, there will be no escape. Patch knew she couldn't ignore this any longer. Whatever was happening to her, whatever connection she had to the rider and the world he came from, it was real. And if she didn't find answers soon, the next time he appeared, there would be no interruption to save her. The hunt had begun. And Patch was the prey. The days after the rider's first appearance blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and dread. Patch barely slept, jumping at every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the window. Her parents noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, but they chalked it up to stress. Exams, maybe, or teenage angst. They didn't see what she saw. They didn't hear the whispers, but someone else did. On a rain-soaked afternoon, as Patch hurried home from school, a voice called out to her, soft but deliberate. "You see them too, don't you?" She turned to find a boy watching her from beneath the awning of a boarded-up shop. He was around her age, maybe a little older, with sharp features and eyes that seemed too knowing for someone so young. His name was Silas, he said, and he'd been waiting for her. Waiting for me? Patch's pulse spiked. Was this another trick? Another monster wearing a human face? Silas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a murmur. The shadows, the things that move when no one's looking. You've seen them, and now he's seen you. A chill slithered down Patch's spine. The rider, Silas's expression darkened. He's not the only one, but he's the worst. Over lukewarm coffee in a diner booth, Silas told her things that made her grip her cup just to feel something solid, something real. The rider wasn't human, had never been human. He belonged to something older, something that existed in the spaces between worlds. And for reasons no one understood, he'd chosen her. You're a bridge, Silas said. A door. And he wants you open. Patch's mind reeled. None of this made sense. But then Silas reached into his pocket and slid a small, twisted piece of metal across the table, a symbol she recognized from her nightmares. This was nailed to my door the night after I first saw him, he said. It's a mark, a claim Patch's breath caught. I found one under my pillow yesterday. Silas's jaw tightened. Then we're out of time. That night the dreams came harder, sharper. Patch stood in the shadow place again, but this time she wasn't alone. Silas was there, gripping her arm, his voice urgent. Run! Now! Behind them the ground split open, and the rider rose, Not a shadow this time, but solid, real, his elongated limbs unfolding like a spider's. His mouth stretched too wide, teeth glinting like shards of glass. "You can't hide from me, little bridge," he crooned. "I'll carve my way through." Patch woke screaming, her sheets soaked with sweat. But the nightmare didn't end there, because Silas was in her room. "How did you—" "Same way you just pulled me into your dream," he panted, yanking her out of bed. "We're linked now, and he's coming. For real this time." Outside, the wind howled like a living thing. The walls groaned, and then silence. A silence so deep it felt like the world holding its breath. A knock at the door, not the front door, her bedroom door. 3 slow, deliberate raps. "Open the door, Patch." The rider's voice oozed through the wood, sweet and rotting. "Let me in." Silas shoved a knife into her hand, a blade etched with the same twisted symbols. "Don't let him touch you," he whispered, "or you'll never wake up." The doorknob turned. By itself. The doorknob turned with a slow, deliberate creak, and Patch's breath locked in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move, as if the air itself had thickened into tar. Silas's grip on her arm tightened, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Don't look at his eyes," he hissed. "Don't let him in." The door swung open, but there was nothing there. Just darkness, a yawning void where the hallway should have been. The kind of dark that pulsed, alive and hungry. Then from the blackness a footstep. Then another. The rider emerged like smoke given form, his 2 long limbs unfolding into the room. His face was a shifting nightmare, features melting and reforming, a dozen different faces, none of them human. But the eyes stayed the same, glowing, locked on hers. "You've been hiding from me," the rider murmured, his voice a chorus of whispers. "But little birds always fall." Patch's hand shook around the knife. "What do you want?" The rider smiled, his mouth splitting wider than any human's should. "You already know." Silas lunged first, throwing something, a handful of black salt, straight into the rider's face. The creature hissed, recoiling as the substance sizzled against his skin like acid. "Now!" Silas yelled. Patch didn't think. She moved. The blade flashed, slicing through the rider's outstretched hand. Black smoke, or maybe it was blood, erupted from the wound. The rider screamed, a sound that didn't belong in this world, and the room bent around them, walls warping like wet paper. Then, silence. The rider was gone. But so was the door. Where it had been, there was only a gaping hole in the wall, opening into a tunnel of writhing shadows. And from deep inside something called. Not the rider's voice, something older, something worse. Silas staggered to his feet, face ashen. "We woke it up." Patch stared into the abyss. The knife in her hand hummed, warm against her palm. "Woke what up?" Silas didn't answer. Because the shadows were moving, stretching, reaching for them. The shadows didn't just move. They surged, liquid and alive, wrapping around Patch's ankles like cold fingers. She stumbled back, slashing with the knife, but the blade passed through the darkness as if it were smoke. Silas grabbed her wrist, yanking her away just as the shadows coalesced into something solid. A figure, tall and emaciated, its hollowed-out face inches from hers. "You don't belong here." The voice wasn't the rider's. It was deeper, older, the sound of stone grinding against stone. Patch's breath came in ragged gasps. "Then let us go." The shadow thing tilted its head, studying her with eyes like pits of tar. "You opened the door. You crossed the threshold. There is no going back." Silas stepped forward, his voice steadier than his hands. "She didn't know what she was doing. The rider forced her." "The rider is a servant," the shadow interrupted. "A scavenger. You think he is the danger?" It laughed, a sound like breaking glass. He is just the beginning. Then, with a flick of its wrist, the shadows parted, revealing a vision that made Patch's knees buckle. A city. But not any city. Her city, twisted and rotting, buildings sagging like corpses, streets choked with vines that pulsed like veins. And in the center of it all, a tower of black stone, its peak lost in a storm of swirling darkness. "This is what comes," the shadow whispered. "This is the world he wants to make, and you, little bridge, are the key." Patch's stomach lurched. "Why me?" The shadow leaned in, its breath like damp earth. "Because you are the only one who can see." Silas's grip on her tightened. "We have to go. Now." But the shadows were already closing in, the vision fading, the room dissolving into chaos. The last thing Patch heard before the darkness swallowed them whole was the shadow's final, mocking whisper. "Run if you want. He will always find you." The darkness spat them out into a place that was neither dream nor reality, a twisted version of Patch's own neighborhood, where the sky burned an unnatural violet and the air smelled of rust and decay. The tower from her vision loomed in the distance, its jagged peak pulsing like a diseased heart. Silas coughed beside her, his face streaked with grime. "We're in the in-between now," he said. "The place the rider wants to drag into our world." Patch's skin prickled. "How do we stop him?" Before Silas could answer, the ground trembled. From the alleyways, from the broken windows, from the cracks in the pavement, shadows peeled free, taking shape. Dozens of them, hundreds. And at their center, the rider, his form flickering between man and monster. "You can't run forever," he called, his voice slithering through the air. "Give in, and I'll make it quick." Patch's fingers tightened around the knife. "What do we do?" she whispered to Silas. His eyes were grim. "Only you can close the door, but it'll cost you." "What cost?" "Your memories, your light, the things that make you you." The shadows surged forward, the rider lunged, and Patch chose. She plunged the knife into her own palm. Blood, real blood, bright and burning, dripped onto the cracked earth. The world screamed, the tower shuddered, the shadows writhed like dying things. The rider's face twisted in fury. No! But it was too late. The light erupted from Patch's hand, searing through the darkness, through the lies, through the fear. The in-between unraveled, the tower collapsing into nothingness, the shadows dissolving like smoke in the wind. The last thing Patch saw before the light consumed her was the rider's face, not monstrous, not cruel, but afraid. Then silence. Patch woke in her own bed, the morning sun streaming through the curtains. Her hand ached, but when she turned it over there was no wound, no scar, no knife. Downstairs her mom hummed over breakfast. The world was ordinary, safe, but sometimes in the corner of her eye she'd catch a flicker of movement, a whisper of something just out of sight. And she'd smile, because she knew the truth now. The dark wasn't gone, but neither was she.